July 1944. The sun hung low in the Kansas sky, casting long shadows over the small, dusty military camp just outside the town of Caldwell. The air was thick with the oppressive heat of summer, but the real heat was inside the camp. The tension of war, the heat of battle thousands of miles away, and the unspoken understanding that the world was changing had all converged in this unlikely place. Private William Harper was stationed at the camp, far from the front lines of Europe, far from the bloodshed and the chaos of war that he had witnessed in France. He wasn't a seasoned soldier, not a combat veteran, but he had learned quickly enough. The war had a way of teaching you hard lessons, lessons you never asked for and didn't want to learn. But here in the American heartland, life moved at a different pace, though the war's shadow loomed over everything. Harper's duty was simple enough: overseeing the women prisoners of war who had been brought to the United States following the fall of Germany. The women weren't soldiers, not like the men who had fought in the war. They were mothers, daughters, and wives, caught in the web of a conflict that had ravaged Europe and altered the course of history. They had been brought to this remote camp and put to work, sewing uniforms, cooking meals, and doing menial tasks. They were treated as captives, though. Unlike the soldiers who fought on the front lines, they had not chosen this fate. They were not enemy combatants in the traditional sense, but that didn't matter. They were prisoners now. As Harper walked through the camp's barracks, his boots kicking up the dust, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. He didn't know what it was, but the air had shifted. The usual monotony of life in the camp felt different. The women worked quietly as they always did, their faces blank, their eyes tired. They had long stopped speaking to the soldiers who guarded them, their language a barrier not just of words but of distance. They were the enemy, and yet they were just women who had lived through the horrors of a war that had destroyed their homes, their families, and their future. It was then that Sergeant Miller, the officer in charge of overseeing the prisoners, called Harper over. Miller's sharp eyes had been watching him for days now, and Harper could feel the weight of that gaze. There was something in the way Miller moved, in the way he spoke, that suggested this wasn't going to be a normal day. "Private," Miller said, his voice low, "we've got something different today. The higher-ups are sending in something special for the women." Harper raised an eyebrow. "What kind of special, Sergeant?" Miller didn't answer immediately. He just nodded toward the camp's canteen, where soldiers were unloading crates from a truck. The crates were strange, heavily packed, tightly sealed. It wasn't food rations, that was for sure. There was a different kind of anticipation in the air, and Harper couldn't figure out what it was. "Take a look," Miller said, motioning for him to follow. As they approached the truck, the smell hit them. It was rich and savory, something Harper had only smelled in the kitchens of home before the war. The aroma was so intoxicating, so unexpected, that for a moment Harper's guard dropped. It was a smell that made his stomach growl, a smell that promised comfort, warmth, and something familiar. "What is that?" Harper asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Miller turned to him, a rare smile creeping across his face. "Hamburgers," he said, with a hint of amusement. "They want to give the women a taste of something they've never had before." Harper stared at him, unsure whether to laugh or take it seriously. Hamburgers? They were going to feed the prisoners hamburgers? "That's right," Miller said, reading his thoughts. "The higher-ups think it'll boost morale. And who knows, maybe it'll make them see things a little differently." Harper couldn't believe it. Hamburgers in the middle of a war? It seemed absurd. But as the soldiers began unloading the crates, Harper realized this wasn't a joke. Inside were neatly packaged boxes filled with fresh patties, buns, pickles, and all the fixings. He couldn't help but feel a pang of disbelief. These women, who had lived in the harshest conditions imaginable, were about to eat like soldiers back home. Miller watched Harper's reaction with a knowing look. "You're going to help with this. The women are going to try it, but I want you to watch how they react. It's important." Harper nodded slowly, his mind still spinning. This wasn't a military operation. This was something else. A gesture, perhaps, an offering from the Americans to the women they had imprisoned. But why? Was it out of kindness? Or was it something more insidious, a way to manipulate them, to make them feel indebted? He couldn't figure it out, but he had a feeling that whatever it was, it was going to have an impact far beyond a simple meal. He followed Miller to the canteen, where the women had gathered. The women looked up as the crates of food were set down before them. They were hesitant, unsure of what was happening. The soldiers began placing trays before them, and Harper could see the confusion in their eyes. None of them had ever seen food like this before. Food that didn't taste like ash, food that wasn't rationed, food that was more than enough to fill their empty stomachs. Harper watched as one of the women, a tall blonde named Ingrid, approached the tray with hesitation. Her hands shook slightly as she took the burger in her hands, unsure of what to do. It was a small, insignificant moment, but for some reason, it felt like everything had changed in that instant. Ingrid's eyes met Harper's across the room. There was a flicker of something more than just surprise. It was the flicker of a possibility that this small gesture, this ordinary American food, could change the way they saw their world. The tension in the room was palpable as Ingrid took her first bite. Harper held his breath, unsure of what to expect. Would they spit it out, disgusted by the strange taste? Would they eat it with hunger, driven by the desperation of their circumstances? The room fell silent as Ingrid chewed. Then, almost imperceptibly, a small smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. She took another bite, her eyes widening slightly. It was a small moment, but in that moment, everything shifted. In the midst of war, of hardship, of pain, the simple taste of a hamburger, the taste of home, of something normal, had ignited something within them. But what would this moment really mean for them? Would it be a fleeting comfort, a small kindness lost in the depths of war? Or would it be the beginning of something bigger, something that could change the course of their lives? Harper didn't know, but he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was just the beginning of a change neither the soldiers nor the prisoners could predict. In the days that followed the unexpected delivery of hamburgers, a subtle shift occurred in the camp. What had been a small, isolated act of kindness had slowly evolved into something far more complex, something that neither the prisoners nor the soldiers could have foreseen. Private William Harper couldn't stop thinking about that first day, the way the women had reacted to the hamburgers, the small smiles that flickered across their faces, the hesitant joy in their eyes. It was a powerful moment, but the more he thought about it, the more he began to question what exactly had been achieved. Was this act really a gesture of goodwill, or was it just another tool of manipulation, a way for the soldiers to make the women feel indebted? Harper tried to push these thoughts aside. He was a soldier, not a philosopher. His job was simple, to follow orders. But he found it hard to ignore the feeling that something was shifting in the camp, something more than the women's simple reaction to a meal. It was as though the act of feeding them had unlocked something that hadn't been there before. A crack in the walls of their imprisonment, a glimpse of a world they had never imagined, and a way for them to regain some semblance of agency. Ingrid, the tall woman who had first bitten into the hamburger, was at the center of it all. She had become more vocal in the days after the meal, though her words were often quiet, measured. She no longer kept her head down when she spoke to the soldiers. Her eyes were steady, no longer clouded with the same sadness and fear that had once dominated her demeanor. Harper watched her closely, noticing how she interacted with the others, the way she seemed to be carrying herself with more confidence, more purpose. One afternoon, while Harper was making his rounds near the camp's perimeter, he saw Ingrid talking with another woman, Clara, a younger prisoner who had been quiet, almost invisible since their arrival. Clara had a delicate frame, her face pale, her eyes large with fear. She hadn't spoken much, preferring to remain in the background, avoiding attention. But now, as she listened to Ingrid, something was different. Clara's posture had changed. She was standing straighter, her eyes fixed on Ingrid, her expression thoughtful. Harper had seen this shift before, but never like this. He watched as Ingrid spoke to Clara, her words coming faster now, her tone more forceful. The words were too soft for Harper to make out, but the energy between them was unmistakable. Ingrid was leading, guiding Clara into something. What was it? It wasn't just a conversation. It felt like an exchange of something larger, something that had the potential to break the walls of their captivity. But that feeling of discomfort, of something about to shift, lingered like a heavy fog in the air. Harper couldn't ignore it. He had seen enough to understand the power of influence, especially in the delicate dynamics between captor and captive. Was Ingrid simply finding her voice, or was something more dangerous at play? The camp had always been a place of tension, but now Harper could feel that tension building in a way that was different from before. It wasn't just about the daily routines or the occasional flare-ups between the prisoners and soldiers. This was something more subtle, a psychological undercurrent that seemed to pulse through the camp, carried by the women's renewed sense of autonomy. They were starting to see themselves not just as victims, but as people capable of change. They had tasted freedom, however fleeting, in the form of the hamburger, and now they were beginning to question their reality. That night, as the camp settled into its usual uneasy quiet, Harper's thoughts were interrupted by a loud bang, a crash that came from one of the barracks. He jumped to his feet, his heart racing. In a heartbeat, the calm of the evening shattered, and the camp was alive with shouts, confusion, and the sounds of hurried footsteps. He rushed toward the noise, his pulse pounding in his ears. As he reached the barracks, he saw Ingrid standing in the doorway, her face flushed, her hands clenched at her sides. Clara stood beside her, visibly shaken, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. "What's going on here?" Harper demanded, his voice sharp as he approached. Ingrid's gaze flicked toward him, but she didn't step back. She stood her ground, as though she had every right to be there. "There's a problem, Private," she said quietly, her voice steady but with an edge. "Clara is refusing to go back to her work assignment. She doesn't want to go back to the kitchens." Harper blinked in surprise. Clara had always been the quiet one, the obedient one. For her to stand up like this was unheard of. She had always followed the rules, her head down, her eyes avoiding any conflict. But now she was standing beside Ingrid, her body language defiant. It was like a spark had been ignited within her. "Why?" Harper asked, his voice softer now, trying to understand. Clara's eyes met his, and for the first time there was no fear in them, just a quiet determination. "I can't go back there," she said, her voice trembling slightly but firm. "I can't keep pretending. I don't want to serve them. I don't want to be a part of their system anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Harper's mind raced. What was happening here? What was Ingrid teaching her? And how had this simple act of giving food turned into something more? A catalyst for change? For rebellion? Before Harper could speak, Sergeant Miller appeared at his side, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "What's this all about, Private Harper?" he asked, his tone sharper now. There was a noticeable tension between Miller and Ingrid. Harper had seen it before, but now it was different. "She refuses to go back to work," Harper explained, glancing back at Ingrid, who stood with her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "She says she can't be part of the system anymore." Miller looked from Harper to the women, his gaze settling on Ingrid. "What's going on here, Ingrid? Are you stirring up trouble?" Ingrid didn't flinch. She stood tall, her posture unyielding. "I'm not stirring up anything. I'm just telling the truth. We don't belong here. We're not slaves. You're not our masters anymore." Harper felt a chill run down his spine. Her words were bold, dangerous even, but there was something in them that resonated. The camp, the captivity, it had become a reality they had learned to accept. But now it was being questioned, and the consequences of questioning it, of confronting the soldiers, were unknown. Miller's jaw tightened. "You'll go back to work, Ingrid, or there will be consequences." The silence that followed was deafening. Harper could feel the weight of the moment, the invisible thread pulling them all towards something inevitable. This wasn't just about hamburgers anymore. It was about something far deeper, something that had been set in motion the moment the women had been given a taste of freedom. The balance of power in the camp had shifted, and nobody, not even Harper, could predict where it would lead. For the first time since his arrival, Harper felt the unmistakable sense that something was about to break. Something that couldn't be fixed. Something that would change everything. And in the distance, the smell of hamburgers, long gone, seemed to linger in the air, a haunting reminder of the line they had crossed. The heat of the Kansas summer had long since become unbearable. But the tension in the air was what truly made it oppressive. The camp, which had once felt like a cage, now felt like a powder keg, ready to explode at any moment. Private William Harper could feel the pressure building every time he walked past the women. Every time he caught sight of Ingrid, her eyes more defiant, more resolute, as though she had uncovered a secret truth about herself, one that no longer fit within the confines of the camp or its rules. It had been 3 days since Ingrid had defied the order to return to her work assignment, and since then, the situation had only worsened. Clara, the once quiet woman, had joined Ingrid in refusing to comply, and their actions had begun to stir whispers among the others. The defiance had spread like wildfire, growing in strength with each passing hour. More and more women began to question their roles in the camp, their lives as prisoners. The act of rebellion, small as it seemed, had become something more, a symbol, a call to action. Harper had been caught in the middle of it all. The sergeant had ordered him to handle the situation, to get the women back in line. But what exactly did that mean? What was his role in this small, escalating rebellion? He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was part of the force that held these women captive, part of the machinery that kept them silent, subjugated. And every time he walked past Ingrid's determined face, or Clara's tear-streaked cheeks as she spoke in whispered tones to the others, a little more of his resolve chipped away. Then everything changed in an instant. It began with a simple order from Sergeant Miller, an order that would irrevocably alter the course of events. "Private Harper," Miller called to him early one morning. His voice was cold, clipped. "We need to make an example of them. Bring Ingrid and Clara to me. We can't let this insubordination spread any further." Harper stood frozen in place, the weight of Miller's words sinking in like a heavy stone in his stomach. The women, now more vocal, more empowered by their rebellion, would be punished. Miller had made it clear that this wasn't just about restoring order. It was about breaking them, reminding them who held the power. "You have your orders, Private," Miller said again, his voice rising. "Do I need to repeat myself?" Harper nodded, though his heart felt heavy. He didn't want to do this. He didn't want to be the one to drag Ingrid and Clara from their barracks, to march them to Miller's office, to be part of the punishment that was about to unfold. He had already seen the cracks in their resolve, the way they clung to each other for support. To break them now would be to destroy the fragile hope they had started to build. But Harper was just a private, just a cog in a much larger machine. And if there was one thing he had learned since being deployed to the camp, it was that disobedience could not go unpunished. The fear of what would happen to him if he didn't comply gnawed at him like a constant presence in his thoughts. He could already hear the whispers behind his back, the questions, the judgment. He had no choice but to follow orders. He walked toward the barracks where Ingrid and Clara were staying, his boots heavy against the ground. The camp was eerily quiet. The women scattered about, pretending to work as usual, their eyes darting to him, aware of the tension that hung in the air. When he reached the door, he hesitated. For just a moment, he considered turning around, abandoning his mission, walking away from the situation before it could unfold. But the thought of the consequences, of what would happen to him if he didn't follow through, held him in place. He knocked, his knuckles tapping against the wood with a hollow sound. Ingrid opened the door, her face unreadable. There was no surprise in her eyes, no shock at seeing him. She had been waiting for this moment. "What's going on, Private?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge of defiance that made Harper's insides twist. She knew what was coming, just as well as he did. "Sergeant Miller wants to speak with you," Harper said, his voice rough. "Both of you. Now." Clara appeared behind Ingrid, her expression fearful but determined. She was trembling slightly, but her eyes, when they met Harper's, were full of something Harper couldn't quite place. Was it trust, or was it resignation? Harper swallowed hard, his throat tight with the weight of what he was about to do. He had already crossed a line by coming here, by delivering the message. But the real test, the real betrayal, would come when he led them to Miller. The moment he guided them through the gates, he knew there would be no turning back. "Come on," he said, his voice almost a whisper now. "I don't want this to happen, but we have no choice." Ingrid's eyes softened for a moment, a flicker of understanding passing between them. She nodded, her lips set in a thin line, and motioned for Clara to follow. As they stepped into the open air, Harper led them through the camp, the weight of their silent footsteps echoing in his mind. Every step he took toward Miller's office felt like a step further into darkness, further away from the man he had once been. When they reached Miller's office, Harper hesitated before opening the door. He knew what was about to happen inside. He knew that Ingrid and Clara would be humiliated, that they would be punished for their defiance. But what bothered him more than that was the realization that they would break. He knew it, even before Miller spoke a word. This wasn't just about discipline, it was about control. "Private Harper," Miller said as they entered, his voice cold. "Leave us." Harper didn't protest. He stepped back into the hallway, closing the door behind him. He stood there, his back pressed against the wall, his mind racing. He had done what he had to do. He had followed the orders, just as he always did. But the feeling in his chest was a knot, a deep, twisting ache that wouldn't go away. Minutes passed. Harper couldn't tell how many, but every moment seemed to stretch into eternity. The shouting from inside the office began, muffled but unmistakable. Miller's voice, harsh and commanding, mixed with the sound of Ingrid's calm, steady responses. Then Clara's voice, soft, fragile, but defiant in its own way. The walls of the camp seemed to close in on Harper, each breath more difficult to take. And then the door swung open, and Ingrid emerged first. Her face was pale, her jaw clenched, but she held herself tall, as though nothing could break her. Clara followed, her eyes downcast, tears threatening to spill over. Harper's heart sank as they passed him, their eyes avoiding his, their silence speaking volumes. He had failed them. He had done what he had been told, but in doing so, he had betrayed them. He had betrayed the very spark of hope that they had found in the midst of their captivity. Ingrid stopped in front of him, her gaze piercing. For a moment, Harper thought she might say something, some harsh word or condemnation. But instead, she simply gave him a nod, a small gesture that spoke louder than anything she could have said. "You had no choice," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you're not the enemy, Private. You're just another soldier in a war you didn't start." Harper's throat tightened. Her words hung in the air, like a cold wind. She wasn't blaming him. She was acknowledging the painful truth, that in war the lines between right and wrong often blurred, and the choices people made weren't always their own. The door slammed shut behind them, and Harper was left standing in the hallway, his mind a maelstrom of guilt, confusion, and doubt. He had followed orders, but at what cost? What had he done? And where did his own humanity fit into this complex web of war, control, and survival? The camp had shifted once again. The fragile balance of power had been broken, and nothing would ever be the same. The stakes had never been higher, and Harper was caught in the eye of the storm. The air was thick with anticipation as the evening sun dipped low over the camp. For all the brightness of the sky, a shadow loomed over Private William Harper's mind, one that had grown heavier with each passing hour. The events of the past few days had twisted into something far darker than he had ever anticipated. And now, as he stood at the edge of the barracks, watching the light fade, the weight of what was about to happen pressed down on him like a vice. Ingrid and Clara had been punished, physically and mentally, and yet their fire had not been extinguished. They had been humiliated, stripped of whatever remaining dignity the camp had allowed them. But in their eyes, Harper had seen something that terrified him: defiance. In the face of all they had endured, they were still unbroken, still unwilling to bow to the oppression of the soldiers, still determined to regain their freedom, even if it meant risking everything. What had begun as a small act of rebellion, a refusal to follow orders, had now escalated into something far larger, something that would decide the fate of not just Ingrid and Clara, but the entire camp. Harper could feel it, could sense it in the air, the inevitability of what was to come. It was as though the camp itself was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. It was Ingrid's voice that shattered the silence of the evening. She had come to him quietly, almost imperceptibly, standing just beyond the shadows of the barracks, her face pale but resolute. Harper had been prepared for the confrontation, but nothing could have prepared him for the words she was about to speak. "We have to leave, Private," Ingrid said, her voice low but steady. "Now. Tonight." Harper's heart raced in his chest. He had suspected it for days, but hearing it out loud, he felt the full weight of it crash over him. "What are you talking about? You can't escape. You'll be caught before you even get past the gate. You'll be—" "I know," she interrupted, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that silenced him. "But it's the only way. If we stay here, we'll die slowly, bit by bit. It's not just about survival anymore. It's about freedom. For us. For all of us." Harper swallowed hard. The words felt like a thunderclap, shaking his entire being. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the cage of duty and responsibility tightening. He had followed orders, done what was expected of him. But this was different. This wasn't just a mission. This was life or death. This was the point of no return. "You don't understand," Harper said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I can't help you escape. I'll lose everything. My rank, my position, my future. I—" Ingrid stepped closer, her expression softening, but her eyes unwavering. "And if you don't help us, Private, what happens then? You'll just keep doing the same thing? Watching us suffer, knowing you could have done something?" Harper closed his eyes, feeling the heat of the decision rising in his chest like a wave. She was right in a way. Every moment he stayed silent, every moment he remained complicit in the prison camp's routine, he was contributing to their suffering. The guilt had been gnawing at him for days, eating away at him slowly. But this was something else. The choice wasn't just about his own survival or fear. It was about what kind of person he wanted to be when the war was over. Could he live with himself if he turned his back now? He didn't have an answer, not yet. But Ingrid was waiting, her gaze steady, unwavering, as though she knew the battle Harper was fighting inside himself. "I can't do this alone," she said, her voice gentle now, as though she understood the weight of his dilemma. "We can't do this alone, but we can do it together." Harper's heart hammered in his chest. The words seemed to hang in the air, charged with something far beyond the immediate threat. The world around them, the camp, the soldiers, the war, seemed to blur, leaving only Ingrid, her courage, and his own shame. Before he could respond, a low shout broke the silence. "Private Harper, where the hell are you?" It was Sergeant Miller's voice, sharp and commanding, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Harper stiffened. The moment had passed. Miller was here, and the mission, his duty, was about to be thrust back upon him. The choice was no longer his. "Harper!" Miller shouted again, closer now. Harper looked back at Ingrid. The terror in her eyes was palpable, and yet there was no fear, only resolve. She wasn't asking him to take a risk. She was demanding it. "I'll help you," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "But you have to move quickly. It's now or never." Ingrid nodded, and Harper turned to look toward the barracks. The soldiers were still nearby, scattered around the camp. But there was a gap, a small window of opportunity. If they moved fast enough, they could slip past the guards and into the cover of the night. Harper felt the urgency building in his chest. "Go to the fence. I'll create a distraction. I'll meet you there." Ingrid didn't hesitate. She didn't say another word. She just turned and walked swiftly toward the edge of the camp, her silhouette fading into the shadows of the night. Clara was already waiting, hidden behind one of the buildings, her face pale with fear, but determined. The plan was in motion. Harper moved quickly, his pulse racing as he approached the soldiers near the barracks. He had only moments to act, moments to create enough chaos for Ingrid and Clara to slip past the perimeter. His hand brushed the edge of his rifle, his mind racing for a plan that would give them the time they needed. "Private Harper!" Sergeant Miller's voice was sharp now, his steps echoing closer. "What the hell are you doing? Get back here!" In that instant, everything seemed to slow down. Harper could feel the sweat gathering on his brow, his heart pounding in his chest like a drum. His thoughts screamed at him to stop, to think, to reconsider. But there was no time for doubt. There was no time for hesitation. He drew his rifle and fired into the air, the shot ringing out like a thunderclap across the camp. "Enemy movement!" he shouted at the top of his lungs. "Infiltrators!" The camp erupted into chaos. Soldiers scrambled for their weapons, shouting, pulling their gear from the barracks. In the confusion, Harper ran toward the fence, his legs burning with each step. He could hear the shouts behind him, the sound of soldiers calling orders, but he pushed it all aside. When he reached the fence, Ingrid and Clara were already there, waiting for him, their faces full of fear, but also something else. gratitude, hope. Go, Harper said, his voice tight with the weight of what he had just done. Now! They didn't need to be told twice. Ingrid and Clara climbed quickly, scrambling over the barbed wire, their hands trembling but steady. One by one, they dropped down the other side, disappearing into the darkness. Harper turned back, his eyes locking onto the chaos he had created. The soldiers were close now, their flashlights sweeping the camp. But they wouldn't find Ingrid and Clara. They wouldn't find anything except the empty space where a soldier had defied them. Harper's breath came in ragged gas as he turned to follow them, to escape into the night with them. But just as he began to climb, he felt a hand on his shoulder, strong, unyielding. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Sergeant Miller's grip tightened, pulling him back. "Where do you think you're going, Private?" Miller's voice was low, cold with fury. Harper's heart pounded in his chest. There was no escape. There was no way out. The consequences were already here. He turned to face Miller, his back pressed against the fence, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid. "I did what I had to do," Harper said quietly, his voice firm. "You can take my rank, take my future, but you won't take my soul." The words were a declaration, a sacrifice. In that moment, Private William Harper understood the true cost of freedom. It wasn't just about survival. It was about choosing to stand on the side of what was right, no matter the price. And as Miller's fist swung toward him, Harper braced himself, knowing that this moment, this choice, would change everything. The camp was still in chaos when Private William Harper was dragged away, his body numb, his thoughts swirling in a haze of confusion and adrenaline. He had made his choice, the choice to defy his orders, to sacrifice his career, his future, and possibly his life for something that felt right. For something beyond the walls of the camp, beyond the war, a taste of freedom, of humanity that Ingrid and Clara had sought and he had, for the first time, helped them reach. But the consequences came swiftly. Sergeant Miller's grip was iron tight, dragging Harper through the camp as soldiers scrambled in every direction. The gunshot that Harper had fired, meant as a distraction, had torn through the calm, setting off a chain of events that was impossible to reverse. It was an act of desperation, an act that Harper knew would not go unnoticed. Even as they reached the command office, Harper's legs felt as though they could barely support his weight. The barracks doors slammed open as Miller thrust him inside. The dim light inside flickered as the sergeant pushed him into a chair. Harper could feel the weight of Miller's eyes on him, burning through him. He knew what was coming. He had known it from the moment he had fired the shot. "Private Harper," Miller growled, his voice low, dangerous. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've endangered everything we've worked for. You've made this a damn circus. And for what?" Harper's body was cold, his pulse racing. "For them," he said, the words coming out rough, strained. "For the women who are here, for the ones who had no voice, for what's right." Miller let out a bitter laugh, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. "You really think this was about right and wrong? This is war, Harper. There's no right here. There's only survival. You've put us all at risk. You've undermined everything." Harper met his gaze squarely, the fire inside him still burning. "Maybe we're all just surviving, but that doesn't mean we stop being human. It doesn't mean we forget that we have a choice." The room was silent for a long moment, and for the first time, Harper could see the cracks in Miller's demeanor. The hard exterior, the commanding presence. It was starting to crumble. Miller was shaken, but he wasn't ready to acknowledge it. Not yet. "You've made your bed, Private," Miller said finally, his voice dangerously quiet. "You'll pay the price for your disobedience. But this won't be over. Not by a long shot." Harper stood up slowly, ignoring the dizziness in his head, the ringing in his ears. He knew what was coming next. The punishment, the consequence. But something in him had shifted. He wasn't afraid anymore. He had seen too much suffering, too much cruelty, to be afraid of the future. He had chosen a side, and though the cost was steep, it was one he was willing to pay. He didn't know what would happen to him next. He didn't know if he'd be sent to the front lines, stripped of his rank, or imprisoned for insubordination. But he did know this. He had given everything for something real, something that mattered. "I did what I had to do," Harper said, his voice steady now, stronger than before. "And I'd do it again." Miller didn't answer. He simply nodded to the guards standing in the corner, and Harper was escorted away, out of the office, into the cold, dark hallway. He didn't resist. There was nothing left to say. The days that followed were a blur of hard labor, physical punishment, and isolation. Harper was no longer part of the routine he had once known. He was a prisoner now, just like the women, though the consequences he faced were different. The soldiers who had once treated him with a casual camaraderie now avoided his gaze, their eyes cold and distant. He had crossed a line, and the camp, his fellow soldiers, had drawn a line in return. But what haunted Harper the most was not the punishment. It was the silence that had grown between him and the rest of the world. No one spoke of Ingrid and Clara anymore. No one mentioned what had happened, what had been set in motion. The rebellion, the escape, they had faded into the background of the camp's daily routine, overshadowed by the constant, oppressive weight of survival. One morning as Harper sat in his cramped cell, his thoughts turning over and over in his head, the door swung open. A soldier stepped inside. It was one of the men from the camp's perimeter, a young soldier, his face unfamiliar to Harper. "You're being transferred," the soldier said, his voice clipped. Harper blinked in surprise. "Transferred? Where?" "To the front lines. You've been deemed unfit for duty here. The higher-ups think you might be more useful where they can keep an eye on you." The words hit Harper like a punch to the gut. The front lines. The very thing he had feared since joining the army. It was the ultimate punishment, sent to the front lines, where death lurked around every corner, where men became numbers in a list of casualties. But it wasn't just about the punishment. It was about the final severing of his ties to everything he had known. "You're not going to lock me up?" Harper asked, his voice hoarse. The soldier shook his head. "You've made your choice. Now you face the consequences." Harper stood, feeling the weight of the decision he had made settling over him once again. The front lines were a death sentence for anyone unlucky enough to end up there. But in a strange way, he welcomed it. He wasn't going to die in silence. He wasn't going to let his life fade away in the dark corners of a camp where no one remembered what he had done. As he walked toward the gates, the soldier beside him, Harper's mind wandered back to the women, Ingrid and Clara. He had no idea where they were, what had become of them. But in his heart, he carried the belief that they had made it, that they had escaped, that they had found a way to reclaim their freedom. And that was enough. The war raged on, but for Private William Harper, it ended the moment he made his choice. His life from that point forward would never be the same. The consequences of his actions would stay with him, but he knew he had made the right decision. He had sacrificed everything for a fleeting taste of freedom, for the hope that things could be different. And that, in the end, was all anyone could ever hope for.